Welcome to this week's episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast, as always curated by Monocle Solutions. Now this week, we're pulling back the veil that has been cast over the world in our efforts to combat climate change and a commitment globally to reduce our carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. Are we having a sufficiently robust and rigorous debate scientifically about what is practically achievable and feasible, given the way that fossil fuels are embedded into our everyday lives through plastics, through the food we eat, and the way we travel, our technology, and the list goes on. And there is a growing chorus of voices that reckon calls for net zero emissions by 2050 are financially impractical, but also politically impossible, and it raises all manner of interesting questions. It's clearly a seductive argument because this also happens at a time when we've seen some pretty unusual weather events, floods in Dubai, and a really interesting study published in the journal Nature showing that climate damages could reach $38 trillion a year by 2050. And we're already in a world that is at least 1.1 degrees warmer than it was in the late 1800s. So there is a huge tension here. Well, my guest this week has been studying energy all of his life, and energy really is at the center of this conversation, as for more than a century, energy, its availability, its access, and its flows have been intertwined with security and geopolitics. And I think more than ever before, this nexus is going to shape our future. He's Pulitzer Prize winning author Daniel Yergin, and he's been on other platforms of mine in the past. So I'm introducing you to a slightly new audience this time. Daniel, welcome. The Time magazine calls you the one man whose opinion matters more than any other on global energy markets. And you're also were chair of S&P Global. So a lot's happened since the last time we spoke. Your most recent book, The New Map, has since been updated as well after Russia invaded Ukraine. So welcome to the podcast. Maybe you could just share a little bit more about your journey into the field from academia into business in the world of studying energy markets.
Thank you, Michael. It's very good to be back with you and have the opportunity in this podcast. I guess for me, it's been not exactly a straight road. I mean, it all started for me when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, and I had 2 years and nobody was supervising me, and I became basically obsessed with energy and geopolitics. And that led me to the Harvard Business School, where we did a book that ended up as a front page story in the New York Times, and then founded a company called Cambridge Energy Research Associates, CIRA. But I continued to pursue my research interests, and of course, wrote the book, The Prize, which is the one that won the Pulitzer Prize. So it has been decades of trying to understand energy markets, energy industry. And what I've always found, just so compelling is that if you do energy, you're talking about everything from technology to geopolitics. And as you pointed out, you're talking about food too, since 85% of the cost of food is energy one way or the other. So it's a particular way of looking at the world, and I think a very crucial and important way of looking, especially at this juncture.
And let's talk about what we're seeing in the world at the moment. And I know in your recent book, you looked very deeply at the shale revolution and how it's enabled energy independence in the US and how that's impacted US foreign policy and geopolitics. And it's so fascinating to see that, as the world grapples with the existential crisis of climate change, some environmental activists want President Joe Biden to phase out the oil industry, while the Republicans are arguing he's already doing that. So there's already quite a bipartisan fight going on around energy policy in the US. But if we look at it, over 13 million barrels per day was the number that I saw for the last quarter in the US. That was the last quarter of 2023, which is just a staggeringly large number. And if you situate that within the context of what we're seeing globally, in 2022, I think the burning of fossil fuels provided 82% of the world's energy. In 2000, over 20 years ago, it was 87%. So even as we talk about this transition, even as we talk about net zero, and as renewables have undergone tremendous growth, it really has been offset by increased demand for energy. So given this and the complexities involved in energy transitions, how feasible is the target of net zero by 2050?
The way I approach it, Michael, in the new map, and one of the areas that I really encourage people to read is the section on energy transitions. Because everywhere you went in the world, everywhere I went, people talk about the energy transition. So the question of what is an energy transition? And I looked at it and I went back to when I say the energy transition began, which happened to be in January of 1709. And these all took a really long time. And there were really energy additions. Oil overtakes coal, but in the 1960s, but today coal consumption is 3 times what it was in the 1960s. So when people talk about an energy transition today, they are perhaps talking about something that is quite different, quite ambitious. I did a discussion with Bill Gates at our big CERAWeek conference the other week in Houston. And although he's putting a lot of money into energy transition work, I wrote down his comment. He said, it's really difficult. It's really hard. And because for the reasons that you've said. So you look at the US today, it's producing more oil under Joe Biden than it's ever produced before. It's the world's largest producer of oil by far. And it's had major geopolitical consequences in that we don't see turmoil in the Middle East, at least so far, affecting the price of oil, which would have been the case back in the old days when the US was the world's largest importer of oil rather than being the world's largest producer of oil.
You've mentioned in the past that US shale oil production has acted as something of a stabilizing force in the oil market, and you've alluded to it now. Can you just elaborate on how significant this factor has been in comparison to previous decades, where such a buffer didn't exist, given what we're seeing in the Middle East?
I think it's a complete 180-degree turn. When the famous oil crises of the 1970s happened, the U.S. was importing a third of its oil. It went up to importing 60% of its oil. But I think what we've seen now with U.S. energy production and U.S. energy exports is that is, as you say, it's a great stabilizer. It's changed the market not only in terms of physical balances, but geopolitical balance and in terms of psychological balance. The outcome on Europe and Ukraine would have been very different had it not been for the ability of U.S. LNG, among other LNG of the world, to replace Russian gas when Putin tried to use the energy weapon to shatter the coalition supporting Ukraine.
Now, given this, and the OPEC strategy has been to kind of maintain oil prices within a certain range, how sustainable is that from OPEC Plus in the long term, especially considering the unpredictable geopolitical landscape, but also this increasing push towards renewable energy, while you've also got the US as a major oil nation?
Right. Well, it's interesting, you made that comment about how the U.S., really, the world was 87% dependent upon hydrocarbons, fossil fuels down to 82%. But over that same time, the base has actually grown. So it's a bigger number. I think that, in fact, the growth is going to be in the developing world, the emerging markets, whatever term you want to use, the global south. That's where the demand growth will be. And I think we actually need to revise our thinking about energy transition. There's been a tendency to think it's linear. You get in a little motor car and you drive from 2024 to 2050 and you just drive on a straight highway, a straight line, and you get there. In fact, it's going to be a multidimensional energy transition. It's going to unfold at different times, in different priorities, different rates, different technologies, different regions. And, take India. Prime Minister Modi has a big commitment to renewables, big commitment. He's also just committed $67 billion to build out a natural gas supply system. That's kind of a different priority than you see in other parts of the world. And even Germany, Germany's a leader in installing renewable energy. In fact, it was a German demand for solar panels that created the Chinese solar industry. As the Chinese have said to me, they said, thank you, Germany. But Germany's just committed, I think it's $17 billion to build a series of natural gas-fired electric generating plants in order to ensure that they have stability in their electricity system. So that's why it's multidimensional, not the straight line that people like to say, or some people like to say.
Yeah, and again, why, to your earlier quoted point, it is difficult. A big player in this that I think is interesting to understand is China, and obviously for a number of reasons. China is one of the major emitters in the world. Global emissions really are dependent on what China and America do together. But what China has been doing is investing in renewables, but still building numerous new coal-fired power stations just to keep up with its industrial demand, and at the same time investing heavily in the EV supply chain. I think something like 80% of solar panels are now produced in China, and it's got the world's biggest EV maker in BYD, overtaking Tesla. How do you see China's role evolving, given that just in the last couple of quarters, we've seen the narrative around EVs change somewhat. I think while the technology is certainly moved at speed, the practical realities are that it still takes up to 30 minutes to charge an EV. For long distance travel, it's still not as practical, and the price points haven't come down to a point where they're affordable yet.
Well, and please note also, in terms of the announcement about the proposed acquisition or merger of two of the giant mining companies, where copper is an important element in that. Every EV uses about 2.5 times more copper than a conventional automobile. So, to go to your China question, it was interesting in the 14th Chinese 5-year plan, it pointed out they put energy security, the words for energy security, according to my colleagues in Beijing, before the words climate change and energy transition. So China, fundamentally, energy security is paramount. It explains part of their interest in the South China Sea and why they're going down both the renewable track and building coal. And one big reason that they've promoted EVs is that they don't want to see their oil consumption continue to grow. What they see is a security risk in that. But I think that, when I was working on the new map and looking at what's happening in the automobile industry and the parallel developments between Tesla and what was happening in China, I was struck by the fact that I think for China, ultimately, the commitment to EVs reflects what we're seeing today. The sense that they were not going to be able to compete in global markets with conventional internal combustion engines. So they wanted to leapfrog and be the leader in terms of EVs. And that is exactly what's happening. The European automobile industry now is terrified of imports of Chinese EVs. And in fact, the European Union is investigating subsidies. And we're seeing that starting to build up in the United States today. It's interesting. I'm going to a conference on energy transition that one of the big banks is holding. And I know that the CEO of one of the major U.S. automobile makers is there, but so is the CEO of BYD, of the American subsidiary of BYD. That tells you that the world is changing. And China is determined to be the leader in exporting electric vehicles around the world and being price competitive.
Yeah. And much of that also depends on securing a supply of critical minerals, things like lithium, copper, as you mentioned as well. How do you see this playing out in Africa, for example, where it looks increasingly like China has been much more active and the US administration is now starting to wake up to that fact? And we see it around the giant iron ore project in Guinea, the Samandu iron ore project. And there are a few other areas across the African continent where it looks like the Chinese and US foreign policy are going to rub up against each other.
I think your phrase, wake up, is the right phrase, because I think people were, should I say, asleep at the wheel. Then a year, 2, 3 years ago, you started to see governments, Western governments, US, Europe, EU, Japan, international organizations all saying, whoa, the energy transition is going to be more metals intensive. And whoa, China has this kind of very strong position in mining and an even stronger position, a dominant position in processing. And what are we going to do about it? And so you start to see Western governments trying to, as they put it, diversify supply chains. There's a mineral security partnership that the U.S. State Department is championing that aims to diversify supply chains, but away from China. But it's hard. I testified a few months ago to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee about critical minerals. And it was a very interesting because almost every second question I got from a senator was about China. And mining is well known in South Africa. It's a very long-term industry. It's capital intensive. It takes a long time. There's lots of regulatory issues, lots of community engagement issues. So this is not something like software where you can turn on a dime. These are long-term. And in terms of the physical processing, they involve with themselves a lot of energy and environmental issues. The U.S. has 2 copper smelters. I think China has 52 copper smelters. I see no sign that a new copper smelter is going to be built in the United States.
It sounds to me like the US has ceded a lot of ground to China already in establishing itself as a leader in the new green minerals value chain that will drive this push towards net zero. How do you see this playing out, therefore, over the next 10 to 15 years? Is there the ability for the US to catch up, or has China stolen a march that's too big to chase down?
First of all, the U.S. can't do it by itself. It has to work with the Europeans and the Japanese and other countries. Secondly, China has, these are state or parastatal organizations. They have different, they don't worry about shareholders in the same way that Western companies have to worry about shareholders. And, I think South Africa very well knows there have been these cycles of mining companies in terms of investment and overinvestment and underinvestment and shareholder pressure and so forth. So I don't think it's going to be easy. And I think you have to see this in a larger geopolitical context because this is where the energy transition collides with great power competition. I mean, you have it on chips, you have it on TikTok, you have it on finance, you have it, you can go down the list of economic issues that have become very sensitive. And minerals, mining is a really big one. And I think you can feel the sense of competition existing. And here in Washington, I talk to people in government, and they are very conscious of how does the U.S. get capital in, but it is going to be an area of increased geopolitical tension. I don't think it started off that way, by the way. I don't think the Chinese started off saying, oh, this is a political thing. I think Chinese started off saying we're using half the world's copper because we're expanding cities with 20 million people a year moving from the countryside to the city. Therefore, let's secure our supply chains. But I think in the latter part of the last decade and now in this decade, it's gone from being kind of economic driven decisions to have a much more of a geopolitical cast to them.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fascinating to see how it's evolved through the Belt and Road Initiative, and also a lot of speculation that we have here in South Africa about the sustainability of the Chinese economic model. I think if we zoom out demographically, ever since the Chinese Communist Party rolled back the one-child policy, it's been very difficult, and now that that's entrenched culturally, to reignite population growth. And so it faces something of a demographic headwind on that front. There's been a lot of talk about the impact of the hard lockdown of COVID on consumers and consumer confidence. And then there's the property market and the well-known travails of the debt-funded boom in property in China. And so it is facing its own economic headwinds.
I think that's very true. And that's why you've seen they recently had their big development conference where they have a lot of Western CEOs there. And the message that the Chinese were giving to the Western community is we're open for business, come and invest. We'll offer you all the protections. But at the same time, Jinping the week later affirms the strategic relationship with Russia. So I think for Western companies, it's much more cautious. You've seen the U.S. bans Huawei, and the Chinese government replies saying that the Chinese government officers cannot own iPhones, Apple iPhones. So, I think people are going to continue, not just in energy, but in general, trying to diversify their supply chains away from China. That's why you're seeing a big boom in real estate in northern Mexico to build factories. Now, of course, some of those factories that are being built there are being built by Chinese companies who want to take advantage of the special trade relationship between the U.S. and Mexico to get around the growing weight of tariffs on Chinese products coming into the United States.
It's a great observation, that. And often when people say, well, globalization is ended, and they point to this neo-mercantilism that we're engaged in, and you've got the Inflation Reduction Act and what you've just described between China and the US, there are ways around it. And a lot of the Chinese-made products and goods are still getting into the US just through that back door in Mexico. I want to come back to the Russian-Ukraine conflict, though, and this energy transition happens in the theater of great power politics. How has the Russian-Ukrainian conflict altered the geopolitical landscape of energy? What do you see as the long-term impacts on global energy supply chains and international relations that are still to emerge from this ongoing conflict?
Well, I think that the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war there, I mean, in some ways it kind of resonates for me with the Spanish Civil War before the Second World War, because this has been a test bed for new technologies and new warfare, autonomous warfare using, drones, just a different kind of warfare. And at this point, it appears to be a stalemate. It's already gone on for more than 2 years. World War I only went on for 4 years. So we ultimately don't know where the outcome's going to be. The U.S. is now stepped up to continue to provide support, but it certainly altered energy markets. we had a global oil market until February of 2022. The U.S. was importing 700,000 barrels a day of Russian oil to make its refineries more efficient and keep down the cost of gasoline to motorists on the east coast of the United States. Well, we no longer have a global oil market. We have a partitioned oil market. And that's symbolic of what you described of what's happened to globalization. It's a more fragmented one. Russia's main market for exporting natural gas was Europe. That market is closed now. So now you have the US and other LNG suppliers filling the gap. And Russia has a lot of gas that's bottled up that they can't sell right now. And they're hoping to sell it to China. But as one Chinese said to me recently, we don't want to make the same mistake that the Europeans made and be over dependent on Russia, which I thought was an interesting comment. So, but Russia continues to produce. And I think policy of the Western countries led by the US has been to not stop Russian oil exports, but rather to keep a price cap on them to reduce revenues going to the Russian government. And I think we're going to see and starting to see an intensification of that effort. And of course, after Iran launched over 300 projectiles towards Israel, 99% of them intercepted, the U.S. is now putting additional sanctions on Iranian oil, which the main market for Iranian oil, like 80% of it goes to China. And we'll see how aggressively those sanctions are imposed, because at the same time, of course, we have, in case you have not noticed, an election coming in the United States.
Yeah.
And gasoline prices are always a sensitive issue.
Yeah, that is, again, one of the big jokers in the pack, the return of Donald Trump, and it's Trump versus Biden 2.0 here. I don't want to get too much into that just as we're ending our time, Daniel. It's so interesting. Yes, Germany got caught with its pants down, and it was quite something to behold just how strategically naive it was to enable the kind of choke point that Vladimir Putin then exercised in terms of Russian gas into the European industrial juggernaut that is Germany. But I want to come further south to the role of energy security in supporting economic growth in countries like South Africa, India, the global south. What specific policies should these countries implement to enhance energy security while also addressing climate change concerns at the same time, given what we've just discussed and some of the practical difficulties around getting to net zero?
I think that there's a real clash between the global north and global south over climate issues. And I think the agenda has been largely set by the global north. It's been set in Brussels, and Berlin, and Paris, and Washington. And, it was really brought home to me when I was chairing a session with African energy ministers. And one of the ministers from Senegal was saying that they need to build a natural gas pipeline so women don't have to spend hours gathering wood, so they don't have people dying from indoor air pollution. But the European banks would not give them money because that's the policy of the EU, not to give money for hydrocarbon development. Well, first of all, it improves the environment not to burn wood and waste. And she said, but not having the finance, she said, is like taking the ladder away for development. And what do they expect us to do? Jump or fly? And that has just stuck with me as capturing the difference in priorities. And I think this north-south divide, this new north-south divide, is actually one of the reasons that we talk about a multidimensional energy transition, because these countries will use hydrocarbons to development. And some say you need to carbonize in order to decarbonize. Or the reaction in Uganda, having the European Parliament saying, passing a resolution not to build a pipeline in Uganda. Then you look at the per capita income. Germany's per capita income is 60,000, Senegal's is 4,000. Well, you have a difference in priorities, and I don't think that has really been dealt with. And by the way, 80% of the people in the world live in the developing world, and that's where the energy demand growth will be. So, there's one country that I have a dialogue with that's a Central Asian country that its GDP and growth mainly depends upon the export of oil. So they had some German NGOs write an energy plan for them that showed, well, they can completely eliminate oil, but they didn't actually have anything to drive their GDP then. So their income would plummet. So yeah. I think it's that kind of honest reality and exchange that's necessary, and to have a more realistic view of energy transition. If I could just add one other thing, there's this 2050 goal. You mentioned at the beginning, but if you take China, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Russia, they are responsible for about 45% of emissions. None of them have a 2050 goal. And that's where the demand is going to grow. So what's the relevance if China doesn't have a 2050 goal or India doesn't? what's the relevance of a 2050 goal for Belgium?
Yeah, yeah. Or South Africa, for example, which is less than 1% of global emissions.
Does South Africa have a date to target?
We've shared some nationally determined contributions, but we haven't committed fully to it. And we are having the debate in South Africa because many believe that we're trying to be leaders when we still have such deep energy poverty, when we still have some of the world's highest unemployment, and we're not seriously exploring some of the hydrocarbon resources that we have off our coastline. Namibia is, and there are some major new oil and gas discoveries that have been made. Total is looking to drill off the Mozambican coast in Rovuma, and yet here in South Africa, it seems the activists are holding sway and through the courts preventing any further exploration of some of those assets. So it's a robust debate that we're having in South Africa, Daniel, and one that I think it needs more interrogation, and exactly why we wanted to have you on the show, just shedding the global perspective from your vantage point as a respected leader in energy research. So we have to thank you for your time and look forward to catching up with you again soon as things are moving quite quickly in this space. Take care.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be with you again, and we will pick up the discussion as the world continues to change.
That was Daniel Yergin, author of The Prize, The Quest, and The New Map, wrapping up this week's episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast. Before we go, I'd just like to extend our gratitude to our growing audience for tuning in. Please remember to share the content. You can find us on all good podcast platforms. Reach out to me at The Badger on X or email the team at Monocle. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, don't forget to subscribe.